What if I told you the smoothest man in the room built the most important album of 1976, and then watched the label hand everything he built to someone else? Not a scandal, not a breakdown, no drugs, no ego implosion, no public meltdown. Just a man who sold 5 million records, launched one of the biggest bands of the next decade out of his own studio, and then sat in an empty room while Columbia Records quietly decided he was done. He spent 7 years building toward that one moment, one album, one perfect thing. And when it landed, the music business did what it always does with soft, smooth, elegant artists who don't make noise. It used him, and then it moved on. If you haven't done so, like and subscribe. Here is how Boz Scaggs sold 5 million records, gave the world Toto, and got dropped anyway. To understand what happened to Boz Scaggs, you have to understand how long the road to Silk Degrees actually was. He did not stumble into music. He grew up inside it. Born in Ohio, raised in Texas, he met Steve Miller at a private school in Dallas, St. Mark's School of Texas, where Miller taught him guitar at age 12. The two of them played together in bands through high school, through college at the University of Wisconsin, through the blues clubs and dive bars of the early 1960s. When Miller headed to San Francisco in 1967 to form one of the city's first psychedelic rock groups, Scaggs followed. He appeared on the Steve Miller Band's first 2 albums, Children of the Future and Sailor, both released in 1968. Then he left. Different musical instincts, different ideas about where the sound should go. He signed a solo deal with Atlantic Records and released a self-titled album in 1969. A blues and soul record cut at the legendary Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, with a then-unknown session guitarist named Dwayne Allman playing alongside him. Critics loved it. Nobody bought it. So he moved to Columbia Records, and then he spent 5 years going nowhere. Moments in 1971. My Time in 1972. Slow Dancer in 1974. Album after album of carefully crafted, soulful, intelligent music. The critics kept noticing, the charts kept ignoring. His highest position during those 5 years was number 81 on the Billboard 200. Not a miss. A slow-motion disappearance. But here is what you need to understand about those years. Scaggs was not spinning his wheels. He was listening. He was absorbing the West Coast session scene, building relationships with the best young players in Los Angeles, developing an ear for what the decade actually wanted. The warm, sophisticated, blue-eyed soul sound that sat perfectly between radio and a candlelit dinner. He just had not found the right room yet. In 1975, he found it. He relocated to Los Angeles and started building Silk Degrees from the ground up. He handpicked his musicians the way a craftsman selects his tools. He asked around. Several people pointed him in the same direction. A drummer named Jeff Porcaro, a keyboard player and arranger named David Paich, a bassist named David Hungate, 3 young session players who had been running the Los Angeles studio circuit together, on Steely Dan records, on Seals and Crofts records, on dozens of sessions that paid the bills while they waited for something bigger. They were already friends. They were already thinking about forming a band. They just needed the right catalyst. Scaggs was that catalyst. The sessions ran through September and October of 1975 at Davlin Sound Studios and Hollywood Sound Recorders in Los Angeles. Producer Joe Wissert shaped the sound, layered, polished, warm, sophisticated, without being cold. Paich co-wrote 5 of the 10 songs on the album, including Lowdown and Lido Shuffle. The rhythm section locked in so tight, so instinctively,
so bad, got to be so cold. This dog eat dog is a job, ought to get it, one last shot.
That the record stopped sounding like a solo album with a backing band. It sounded like a group, like something alive. Silk Degrees was released on February 18th, 1976. And for a while, it went almost nowhere. The first single, It's Over, peaked at number 38, a mild chart position for a record that had cost real money and real time. Columbia was patient, but the album was not dying. It was building, word of mouth, radio play in pockets. Then one afternoon, a Cleveland R&B disc jockey pulled Lowdown straight off the album and started playing it without waiting for an official single release.
Got you thinking like that, boy.
phones lit up. The station kept playing it. Other R&B stations noticed. Then pop radio noticed. And when Columbia officially released Lowdown as a single in June of 1976, it climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. You heard that song driving home from work that summer. You know you did. Silk Degrees peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200. It spent 115 weeks on the chart. 5 million copies sold in the United States alone. Lido Shuffle hit number 11. Lowdown won the Grammy for Best R&B Song in 1977. The album received a Grammy nomination for Album of the Year. A world tour followed, sold out, coast to coast. Boz Scaggs was not an overnight success. He was a 7-year overnight success. And for one brilliant window of time, he owned the room. But here's the turn. The music business does not celebrate what you did last year. It asks what you are doing right now. And the moment Silk Degrees stopped climbing, the clock started. Columbia Records had a 5 million record artist on their hands. They had invested years in him. They had watched 5 albums go nowhere and stayed patient. And now that patience had paid off in the most spectacular way possible. The label did what labels always do when an artist finally breaks through. They expected him to do it again, immediately, on command. The follow-up album, Down 2, Then Left, arrived in 1977. Scaggs kept the same core players, Paich, Porcaro, Hungate, Ray Parker Jr. on guitar. Same West Coast studio polish. Same sophisticated blue-eyed soul approach. By any reasonable measure, it was a good record. Critics acknowledged it. The album reached number 11 on the Billboard 200, but neither single from the album reached the top 40. In the language of the music business, that sentence means everything. Number 11 on the album chart with no top 40 singles means your audience is still there, but radio has moved on. It means the momentum has a crack in it. It means the label starts quietly recalculating. Columbia did not panic, not yet. There was still goodwill in the room. Scaggs was still a name. The Silk Degrees tour had been enormous. The Grammy was real. The label gave him time and space for the next record. Middleman arrived in April of 1980, and it performed. The album reached number 8 on the Billboard 200, higher than Down 2, Then Left. 2 singles cracked the top 20. Breakdown Dead Ahead at number 15 and JoJo at number 17. There was also Look What You've Done to Me from the Urban Cowboy soundtrack, number 14 on the Hot 100, and Miss Sun from a greatest hits package that same year, also number 14.
It won't be long before the morning has you back in my arms.
4 charting singles in the space of 12 months. On paper, it looked like a resurgence, but here is what nobody tells you. The numbers were smaller, the cultural footprint was smaller. Silk Degrees had been a moment, a record that arrived at exactly the right intersection of sound, era, and audience, and detonated. Middleman was a competent, well-crafted album that performed solidly and left almost no mark on the conversation. The radio programmers played it, the reviews were decent. And then everyone moved on before the needle had even lifted off the vinyl. And at the same moment, the music was quietly receding. Scaggs' personal life was coming apart at the seams. His marriage to his first wife, Carmela, ended in divorce in 1980. The same year, Middleman was released. A bitter custody battle over their 2 sons followed. It lasted 3.5 years before he won joint custody. He described the early 1980s as an ugly time for music, a landscape dominated by synthesizers and MTV, and a visual culture that had no obvious place for a smooth, studio-refined songwriter who had never built his identity around an image. He called it a time when music had left him. So he stopped. Not a dramatic exit, no press release, no farewell tour. He just quietly withdrew, ran his San Francisco restaurant, the Blue Light Cafe, played occasional jam sessions, showed up at a benefit concert for inmates at San Quentin Prison. The man who had spent 7 years clawing toward the top of the chart was gone from it so quietly that most people did not even notice the moment he left. That is all it took. A divorce, a custody battle, a cultural shift he could not position himself inside. and a label that had grown accustomed to results. The silence lasted 8 years. 8 years is a long time in the music business. It is longer than most careers. It is long enough for an entire generation of radio programmers to forget your name. Long enough for the musicians you launched to become bigger than you ever were. Long enough for a label to quietly reclassify you from asset to liability without ever saying so out loud. Boz Scaggs did not spend those 8 years idle. He traveled. He climbed part of Mount Everest. He ran his restaurant. He raised his sons. He tried, in his own words, to figure out what was left of himself outside the machine that had consumed the previous decade of his life. He told an interviewer that fortune and fame were not what they appeared to be, that the demands created by a career at that level were more than he wanted to continue, that he had needed to step outside it. He expected to be gone for a year, maybe 2. It became 8. In the spring of 1985, he finally went back to work. He started writing again. He booked studio time. He spent nearly 3 years, building a comeback album from scratch, painstaking, careful, the way he had always worked, the way that had produced Silk Degrees in the first place. And when he was done, he delivered the finished record to Columbia Records. They rejected it, not quietly, not kindly. The top executives at Columbia told him directly that they did not feel the album had a strong hit single. 3 years of work, sent back. Start over. Think about what that actually means. This was not a new artist being shaped by a label. This was a man with a Grammy Award, a 5 million selling album, and 17 years of history, with Columbia Records being told that what he had made was not good enough to release. That the label's commercial instincts now outweighed his artistic judgment entirely. That the relationship had quietly shifted, at some point during the 8 years of silence, from partnership to something closer to ownership. He went back into the studio. He rebuilt the record from the ground up. He spent 3 more years perfecting it, and the final version, Other Roads, was released in May of 1988, a full 8 years after Middleman. The album peaked at number 47 on the Billboard 200, number 47, for a man who had peaked at number 2. The lead single, Heart of Mine, reached number 35 on the Hot 100 and number 3 on the Adult Contemporary chart. A genuine radio hit, but the album did not find the broader audience Columbia had demanded he chase. It was caught between eras, too polished for the rawness that was coming, too traditional for the synthesizer-driven sound that had taken over the decade. Scaggs himself said he enjoyed listening to it more than any album he had ever made. Columbia looked at the chart position and drew their own conclusions. Other Roads was the last album Boz Scaggs released on Columbia Records. After 17 years, Moments in 1971 through Other Roads in 1988. The relationship was over. His next album, Some Change, came out in 1994 on Virgin Records. A different label, a smaller platform, a quieter re-entry into a world that had largely stopped looking for him. You probably owned Silk Degrees, a lot of people did. You heard Lowdown on the radio that summer of 1976 and felt something shift in the room. That groove, Page's keyboard locked against Porcero's drum pattern, Hungate's bass sitting underneath it like a foundation, was one of the defining sounds of its era. Clean, warm, sophisticated without being cold, adult without being boring. The sound of a specific moment in American music that has never quite been replicated, and almost nobody who heard it knew what it had cost to make. But here is the kicker. The musicians Boz Scaggs assembled for Silk Degrees, the young session players he handpicked, whose careers he solidified, whose chemistry he provided the stage for, did not fade with him. They became Toto. David Paich and Jeff Porcero, inspired by what they had built together in Scaggs' studio, formalized the band in 1977. Columbia Records, the same label that would later reject Scaggs' comeback album and quietly let him go, offered Toto a record deal without an audition. Steve Porcaro described it as a record deal thrown in their laps. Paich said he was not sure Toto would have happened as soon or in quite the same way without Silk Degrees. Toto released their debut album in 1978. Hold the Line reached the top 5. Their fourth album, Toto 4, in 1982, produced Rosanna at number 2 and Africa at number 1.
Rosanna, she hears only whispers of some quiet conversation.
They won 6 Grammy Awards in a single night. They went on to sell over 40 million records worldwide. 40 million records. For a band that was born in Boz Scaggs' recording sessions. The same Columbia Records that told Scaggs his comeback album lacked a strong hit single had signed Toto on the strength of his name and his success. The label used his momentum to launch another act, watched that act become one of the biggest bands of the decade, and then handed Scaggs back his finished album with a note that said, "Try again." And just like that, the smoothest man in the room was standing outside the building he had helped construct. There is one more thing that sits under all of this. One detail that does not appear in the official narrative. Scaggs' son, Oscar, one of the 2 boys he had fought a 3.5-year custody battle to keep close, died of a heroin overdose on December the 31st, 1998. He was 21 years old. The years of absence from the music business, the withdrawal, the silence, they were not just about creative burnout or label politics. They were about a man trying to hold his life together while the industry kept score without him. The chart positions tell one story. The full story is quieter and harder than that. Lowdown is still an airplay staple today. It appears in films, it surfaces in television shows. It plays in restaurants and hotel lobbies and on adult contemporary stations in cities Scaggs has not performed in for decades. The song keeps earning, the legacy keeps accumulating. And Toto, the band that would not exist without the session that produced it, keeps touring, keeps releasing records, keeps collecting the recognition that followed directly from the room Boz Scaggs built in the autumn of 1975. He gave the music business one of its most elegant albums. He gave it one of its most successful bands. And the music business gave him a rejection letter and a quieter exit than he deserved. Here is what you should take away from all of this. Boz Scaggs did not fail. The word does not apply. He made one of the most perfectly constructed albums of the 1970s. He assembled a group of musicians so talented that a major label handed them a record deal just for being in the same room as him. He won a Grammy. He sold 5 million records. He spent 115 weeks on the Billboard 200. And then the industry did what it always does with artists who peak smoothly and quietly, without scandal, without spectacle, without the kind of wreckage that generates headlines. It moved on, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without a phone call. Next time Lowdown comes on, and it always does, listen to that groove underneath it. That is David Paich on keyboards. That is Jeff Porcaro on drums. That is David Hungate on bass. 3 young men who walked into Boz Scaggs' session in 1975 and walked out with a record deal and a future. The song that made them possible is still playing. The man who made them possible is not in the frame. Now you know his name, and you know the full price of that groove. If this story hit you the way it should, go ahead and turn it up. Hit the like button, hit subscribe if you have not already. And to my subscribers, you already know. You are the smoothest ones in the room. You rock.